How did history's wisest man end up marrying 1,000 women and eventually bowing down to idols? King Solomon asked God for wisdom and received it. But wisdom itself couldn't protect him. Tonight, we'll discover how the world's smartest man became a prisoner of love and how wisdom can transform into foolishness. Because sometimes our greatest enemy is our own success. As you settle in tonight, imagine standing in the most magnificent palace ever built, where gold covers the walls like wallpaper, where ivory thrones rest beneath cedar ceilings, and where the wealth of nations flows like rivers through corridors lined with precious stones. This is not a fairy tale palace, this is the historical court of King Solomon, where wisdom and wealth reached heights never before seen in human history. But as you walk through these golden halls tonight, you'll discover something that challenges everything we think we know about success, wisdom, and the human heart. Behind all this splendor lies one of history's most tragic stories, the tale of a man who could solve any problem except the one that mattered most, the problem of his own heart. Solomon began his reign as the most promising king who ever lived. When God appeared to him in a dream and offered him anything he desired, this young man made a choice that astonished heaven itself. He didn't ask for long life, wealth, or victory over enemies. Instead, he asked for wisdom to govern God's people justly. God was so pleased with this request that he granted not only wisdom but also riches and honor beyond measure. Solomon became the wisest man who ever lived, able to solve disputes with divine insight, to understand the mysteries of nature, and to write proverbs that still guide us today. Yet this same man, this paragon of wisdom, would end his life as a tragic figure, surrounded by foreign wives who had turned his heart away from God, worshipping idols in the very land where he had built God's temple. How does the wisest man in history become such a fool? Tonight, we'll explore the psychology of power, the seductive nature of success, and the tragic irony of a man who understood everything except himself. This isn't just the story of an ancient king's downfall, it's a mirror reflecting the dangers that lurk in every human heart when success, power, and freedom from consequences create the illusion that we are beyond the reach of our own humanity. Come with me into the golden corridors of Solomon's palace, where we'll discover how wisdom can become the very thing that blinds us to our own folly. To understand Solomon's tragic end, we must first appreciate his extraordinary beginning. When David died, he left behind a united kingdom, enormous wealth, and detailed plans for building God's temple. But he also left behind a young son who was acutely aware of his own inadequacy for the massive responsibility ahead. Solomon's humility in his early days was striking. When God appeared to him at Gibeon and said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you," Solomon's response revealed a heart that was still teachable, still dependent on divine guidance. "I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties," Solomon confessed. "So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong." This wasn't false modesty. This was genuine recognition of human limitation. Solomon understood that ruling God's people required more than human intelligence or political skill. It required divine wisdom, the ability to see situations from God's perspective, to understand not just the surface of problems but their deeper spiritual and moral dimensions. God's response was immediate and generous. "Since you have asked for this and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be." The wisdom Solomon received was not merely intellectual brilliance, it was supernatural insight into the human condition. This became evident almost immediately in the famous case of the two prostitutes who both claimed the same baby. Solomon's solution, threatening to cut the child in half, revealed not just cleverness but profound understanding of maternal love and human nature. Word of this judgment spread throughout Israel, and they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. Solomon's reputation for wisdom began to spread beyond Israel's borders, attracting visitors from distant lands who came to test his knowledge and understanding. But wisdom brought with it something that would prove dangerous: success on an unprecedented scale. Solomon's wisdom quickly translated into success in every area of his reign. The kingdom prospered as never before, international trade flourished, and Israel became a major power in the ancient world. The temple he built was considered one of the wonders of the world, and his palace complex took 13 years to complete. The psychological effect of such success was intoxicating. When every decision you make proves brilliant, when every project succeeds beyond expectations, when foreign dignitaries travel thousands of miles just to hear your wisdom, it becomes easy to believe that you are somehow beyond the limitations that constrain ordinary people. Solomon's writings from this period reflect a man who felt he had unlocked the secrets of life. His proverbs demonstrate deep understanding of human nature, practical wisdom for daily living, and profound insights into the relationship between wisdom and righteousness. He wrote with the confidence of someone who had tested life and found the answers. But success began to change Solomon in subtle ways. The young man who had called himself only a little child was being replaced by someone who felt increasingly self-sufficient. The king who had once depended entirely on God's wisdom was beginning to trust more in his own understanding. The first sign of this shift appeared in his building projects. While the temple took 7 years to build, his own palace took 13. The symbolism was clear. Gradually, his own glory was becoming more important than God's glory. Then came the marriages. Initially, these seemed like brilliant diplomatic moves. Ancient kings often sealed political alliances through marriage, and Solomon's wisdom appeared to extend to international relations. His marriage to Pharaoh's daughter brought peace with Egypt and access to Egyptian wealth and knowledge. But each successful political marriage reinforced Solomon's confidence in his own judgment. If wisdom had brought him success in governing, building, and international relations, surely it would guide him safely through the potential spiritual dangers of foreign wives. This is where wisdom began its transformation into foolishness, not through dramatic failure, but through the subtle corruption of success. The psychological progression from one foreign wife to 1,000 didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process that reveals how the human heart can become enslaved to its own appetites, even when guided by supernatural wisdom. Solomon's first foreign marriage, to Pharaoh's daughter, brought tangible benefits. Egypt was no longer a threat, trade relationships flourished, and Israel's international standing was enhanced. The marriage appeared to validate the wisdom of using matrimony as a diplomatic tool. Success bred repetition. If one foreign alliance through marriage was good, wouldn't multiple alliances be better? Each new wife brought new political advantages, new trade opportunities, new sources of wealth and knowledge. Solomon was building a network of international relationships that made Israel the center of ancient world politics. But something deeper was happening psychologically. Solomon was discovering that he could have whatever he wanted, and that realization began to reshape his relationship with desire itself. When you can obtain anything you desire, the logical response seems to be to desire everything. The biblical record is stark in its accounting. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. That phrase, "held fast to them in love," reveals the addictive nature of Solomon's relationships. This wasn't just political calculation anymore, it had become emotional and physical compulsion. The wisest man in the world was becoming enslaved to his own appetites. The number grew, 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. Each new acquisition fed the addiction while making it stronger. Like any addiction, it required more to produce the same satisfaction. What had begun as wise diplomacy had become insatiable hunger. But the most tragic aspect wasn't the number. It was the gradual deadening of Solomon's spiritual sensitivity. Each compromise made the next one easier. Each foreign wife brought not just political alliance but foreign gods, foreign worship practices, and foreign ways of thinking about life and morality. Solomon's wisdom, which had once been his greatest strength, now became the tool of his own deception. He could rationalize each new marriage, justify each new compromise, and explain away each step away from God's commands. After all, wasn't he wise enough to handle these relationships without being influenced by them? This is how wisdom becomes foolishness, not through the abandonment of rational thinking, but through the use of rational thinking to justify irrational choices. The most chilling verse in Solomon's story appears in 1 Kings 11 verse 4. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. This transformation was a gradual erosion over decades. The turning of Solomon's heart began with accommodation, allowing foreign wives to worship their gods. This seemed reasonable. He wasn't abandoning his faith, just being tolerant. But accommodation led to participation. Solomon began joining foreign religious ceremonies, rationalizing it as diplomatic necessity. Participation eventually led to personal worship. The man who built God's temple began building high places for foreign gods, offering sacrifices to Chemosh and Molech. The psychological tragedy is that each step seemed reasonable. Solomon's wisdom provided sophisticated justifications for increasingly dangerous compromises. He could explain why each accommodation was necessary, why each step away from God was actually wisdom. But wisdom cannot override spiritual reality. The heart divided between God and other loyalties becomes a heart that belongs fully to neither. The man who once wrote, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding," was now leaning entirely on his own understanding. The full cost of Solomon's compromises became evident in his later years, when the very wisdom that had made him great became the instrument of his downfall. The book of Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to Solomon, provides a window into the soul of a man who had achieved everything the world could offer yet found it all meaningless. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun, all of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind, wrote the man who had experienced more success, pleasure, and achievement than perhaps any person in history. This wasn't the writing of someone who had failed to achieve his dreams. This was the testimony of someone who had achieved everything and discovered that achievement itself was empty. Solomon's pursuit of pleasure had been systematic and unlimited. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure, he wrote. With unlimited resources and unlimited power, he had explored every avenue of human satisfaction, building projects, acquisitions, sexual pleasure, intellectual pursuits, artistic endeavors, and material accumulation. Yet the conclusion was devastating. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. This wasn't depression speaking, this was wisdom finally recognizing its own limitations. Solomon had discovered that human wisdom, no matter how great, cannot fill the vacuum in the human heart that only God can fill. All his wives, all his wealth, all his achievements had left him spiritually and emotionally bankrupt. The political consequences of his spiritual compromise were equally devastating. God raised up adversaries against Solomon, Hadad the Edomite, Rezin of Damascus, and eventually Jeroboam, one of Solomon's own officials. The kingdom that had known unprecedented peace and prosperity began to experience rebellion and division. Most tragically, God announced that the kingdom would be torn away from Solomon's descendants, with only one tribe remaining loyal to the house of David. The united kingdom that David had built and Solomon had glorified would be divided because of Solomon's unfaithfulness. Solomon's response to these challenges revealed how completely his wisdom had been corrupted. Instead of repenting and returning to God, he tried to solve spiritual problems with political solutions. When the prophet Ahijah announced that Jeroboam would rule 10 tribes of Israel, Solomon's response was to try to kill Jeroboam, a futile attempt to prevent God's decree through human violence. The wisest man in the world had become so foolish that he thought he could defeat God's purposes through assassination. Solomon's downfall reveals a pattern repeated throughout history whenever gifted individuals allow success to corrupt their relationship with God. Understanding this pattern helps us recognize similar dangers. First, the replacement of dependence with confidence. Solomon began acknowledging his need for divine wisdom, but success convinced him he had internalized that wisdom. This is the shift from, God, give me wisdom, to, I am wise. Second, the expansion of perceived authority. Having succeeded where God blessed him, Solomon assumed his wisdom extended to areas where God had given clear prohibitions. Third, the rationalization of compromise. When obedience seemed to conflict with political necessity, Solomon used wisdom to find reasons why rules didn't apply to his situation. Fourth, the gradual hardening of conscience. Each successful compromise made future compromises easier and less significant. Fifth, the complete inversion of values. The man who built God's temple ended building temples to foreign gods. This progression reveals why Scripture warns against trusting human wisdom apart from God. No matter how great our intelligence, the human heart remains deceitful above all things, without divine transformation. When we examine Solomon's life, several critical factors explain how the wisest man became such a tragic figure. These serve as warnings for anyone blessed with success or gifts. First, Solomon confused the gift with the giver. He began recognizing wisdom came from God but gradually thought of it as his possession rather than God's ongoing gift. Second, Solomon believed his own acclaim. Constant praise convinced him he was as special as everyone said. The man who called himself only a little child began believing he was beyond normal limitations. Third, Solomon developed immunity to his own teaching. He wrote proverbs about sexual immorality and wholehearted devotion to God, but familiarity with truth bred contempt for its application. Fourth, Solomon prioritized peace over purity. To maintain household harmony and international stability, he compromised convictions, thinking he could manage spiritual poison in small doses. Fifth, Solomon trusted in compartmentalization. He believed he could worship God in some areas while accommodating foreign gods in others. But a divided heart is ultimately a conquered heart. Finally, Solomon lost sight of mortality and accountability. Success insulated him from consequences so long he forgot even kings must answer to the King of Kings. Solomon's story isn't ancient history. It's a mirror reflecting dangers prevalent in our modern world. We live where success is worshipped, intelligence idolized, and accumulating experiences seen as fulfillment. Consider modern Solomons following similar patterns. Brilliant business leaders who build empires but destroy families, gifted artists creating beauty while living ugly lives, successful politicians gaining the world but losing souls, religious leaders starting with genuine calling but ending in scandal. The pattern remains consistent. Success breeds confidence confidence leads to moral compromise, compromise results in spiritual blindness, and blindness produces the foolishness success was supposed to prevent. Modern technology amplifies Solomon's dangers. Where he had 1,000 wives for variety, we have unlimited access to every stimulation. Where he had international acclaim, we have social media validation. Where he had unlimited wealth, we have consumer culture promising fulfillment through acquisition. Most dangerously, we celebrate what destroyed Solomon: unlimited choice, personal autonomy, rejection of moral authority, and believing intelligence alone guides us safely. Solomon's prayer for wisdom has been replaced by culture's prayer for success, wealth, influence, and freedom from constraints. We want wisdom's benefits without wisdom's required humility. The result: a generation more educated yet confused, more connected yet lonely, more entertained yet less satisfied. We've achieved Solomon's accomplishments while inheriting his problems. Despite its tragic trajectory, Solomon's story offers profound lessons for anyone seeking to live wisely in a world full of temptations and opportunities for compromise. These lessons are especially relevant for those who have been blessed with gifts, success, or positions of influence. First, recognize that wisdom is a gift, not an achievement. It must be continually received from God rather than accumulated like a possession. The moment we begin to think of ourselves as wise rather than as recipients of divine wisdom, we begin the journey toward foolishness. Second, understand that success can be more dangerous than failure. Failure often drives us to God, while success can drive us away from Him. Every achievement should increase our gratitude to God rather than our confidence in ourselves. Third, realize that no one is immune to moral failure. If the wisest man in history could fall so completely, none of us should assume we are beyond temptation or compromise. Humility and dependence on God are not signs of weakness. They are the only reliable defense against spiritual pride. Fourth, accept that some pleasures and experiences are not worth their cost. Solomon had access to everything the world could offer, yet concluded that much of it was meaningless. The fear of missing out on worldly experiences should be replaced by the fear of missing out on God's best for our lives. Fifth, maintain accountability and boundaries. Solomon's downfall accelerated when he isolated himself from people who could challenge his decisions. Surrounding ourselves with people who will speak truth to us, even when we don't want to hear it, is essential for spiritual health. Sixth, remember that compromise is progressive. Solomon didn't wake up one day and decide to worship idols. He got there through a series of small compromises that seemed reasonable at the time. Guarding against small compromises is more important than preparing for dramatic temptations. Finally, understand that true wisdom begins and ends with reverence for God. Solomon wrote, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," but he forgot to live by his own words. All human wisdom that isn't grounded in humble submission to God will ultimately become foolishness. While Solomon's story is ultimately tragic, it points toward a redemptive hope that extends beyond his personal failure. The book of Ecclesiastes, written from the perspective of his later years, shows a man who had rediscovered the futility of life apart from God and was pointing others back to the only source of true meaning. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. These words represent a kind of spiritual restoration, not a return to his former glory, but a recognition of fundamental truth that his years of folly had obscured. Even in failure, Solomon's wisdom could serve others by warning them away from the paths that had led to his downfall. More importantly, Solomon's story points forward to one who would be called greater than Solomon. Jesus Christ, who possessed not just supernatural wisdom but perfect moral character. Where Solomon accumulated wives, Christ remained pure. Where Solomon built a temple with human hands, Christ became the true temple. Where Solomon's wisdom led to pride, Christ's wisdom was expressed through humility and sacrifice. The promise of the gospel is that we don't have to repeat Solomon's mistakes. Through faith in Christ, we can receive not just wisdom for decision-making but transformation of heart that addresses the root issues that destroyed Solomon. We can have both divine wisdom and divine power to live according to that wisdom. For those who have already made some of Solomon's mistakes, his story offers hope for restoration. Even great failure doesn't disqualify us from God's grace or remove us from His purposes. Like Solomon in his later years, we can turn from folly back toward wisdom, from compromise back toward obedience, from self-reliance back toward dependence on God. As you rest tonight, you face the same choice that confronted Solomon throughout his life. Will you trust in your own wisdom or acknowledge your need for divine guidance? Will you seek satisfaction in the accumulation of experiences and possessions, or will you find your fulfillment in God alone? Solomon's story reminds us that intelligence, success, and even spiritual gifts are not sufficient to guarantee a life well lived. The human heart is too complex, the world's temptations too subtle, and our own capacity for self-deception too great for us to navigate life safely without humble dependence on God. But Solomon's story also reminds us that God's gifts come with God's grace to use them well. The same God who gave Solomon wisdom is willing to give us the wisdom we need for our circumstances. The same God who built his temple through Solomon's hands wants to build his kingdom through our lives. The difference lies not in the magnitude of our gifts but in the posture of our hearts. Solomon began with humility and ended with pride. He started by serving God's purposes and ended by pursuing his own. He began as a steward of divine gifts and ended as a collector of worldly treasures. You don't have to follow the same path. You can learn from Solomon's mistakes without repeating them. You can receive God's blessings without being corrupted by them. You can enjoy God's gifts without being enslaved by them. The key is remembering that wisdom is not a destination but a journey. Not an achievement but a relationship, not a possession but a gift that must be received anew each day. The wisest response to Solomon's story is not to avoid seeking wisdom, but to seek it from the right source and with the right heart. Tonight, as you close your eyes, remember that the God who gave wisdom to Solomon offers the same gift to you. But he offers it with the added provision of his Spirit to help you use it well, his grace to restore you when you fail, and his love to satisfy the deep longings of your heart that no earthly success can fill. Sleep peacefully, knowing that true wisdom lies not in having all the answers, but in maintaining a humble, teachable heart before the God who is the source of all wisdom. And wake tomorrow ready to seek that wisdom afresh, having learned from Solomon's example both what to pursue and what to avoid. Good night, and may you rest knowing that the wisdom you need for tomorrow is available from the same God who offered it to Solomon, with the prayer that you will use it more faithfully than he did. **